Few artists in history have defied categorization as profoundly as El Greco. His paintings, characterized by elongated figures, dramatic use of light, and intense emotional expression, set him apart from his contemporaries. Although he lived during the Renaissance, his style was far removed from the balanced compositions and idealized forms that defined the era. Instead, El Greco's art possessed a mystical, almost otherworldly quality that would later be celebrated by modern movements, such as Expressionism and Cubism. His ability to blend Byzantine traditions with the innovations of the Italian and Spanish Renaissances makes him one of the most unique figures in the history of Western art. El Greco's life and work are deeply intertwined with the historical and cultural transformations of the 16th century. Born in Crete, a Venetian-controlled territory at the time, he was exposed to both the Orthodox Christian artistic traditions of Byzantium and the humanist ideals spreading across Europe. His early training in icon painting provided him with a foundation in religious imagery, but his artistic ambitions pushed him beyond the confines of Crete. His journey took him first to Venice, then to Rome, and finally to Spain, where he would achieve the greatest recognition. Each phase of his life introduced new influences and challenges that shaped his distinctive artistic language. Despite his remarkable originality, El Greco was often misunderstood in his own time. His rejection of conventional perspective, his preference for elongated and distorted forms, and his dramatic use of color set him apart from the mainstream artistic currents of the Spanish Renaissance. Many of his contemporaries struggled to understand his unconventional approach, and as a result, his work was frequently met with skepticism. However, his unique vision resonated deeply with certain patrons and religious figures, allowing him to secure important commissions, particularly in Toledo, where he spent the latter half of his life. To fully appreciate El Greco's legacy, it is essential to examine the intellectual and religious climate in which he worked. The 16th century was a period of profound religious upheaval, marked by the Reformation and the Catholic Church's response through the Counter-Reformation. Spain, a dominant force in the Catholic world, played a crucial role in reinforcing the authority of the Church. Art became a powerful tool for religious propaganda, and artists were expected to create works that inspire devotion and reinforce Catholic doctrine. El Greco's paintings, with their spiritual intensity and dramatic compositions, aligned well with these goals, even as they defied traditional artistic conventions. El Greco's artistic style was not only shaped by religious influences, but also by his exposure to the artistic innovations of the Italian Renaissance. His time in Venice introduced him to the bold color palettes of Titian and Tintoretto, while his stay in Rome exposed him to the grandeur of Michelangelo's works. However, rather than simply imitating these masters, El Greco developed a highly personal interpretation of their techniques. He rejected Michelangelo's rigid anatomical precision, instead favoring figures that seemed to stretch toward the heavens, as if reaching for divine inspiration. His use of color was similarly unconventional, with vibrant blues, intense reds, and ethereal yellows, creating an almost supernatural effect. Beyond his artistic contributions, El Greco was also a highly intellectual artist, engaging in philosophical debates about the nature of art and its role in society. Unlike many painters of his time, he saw himself not just as a craftsman, but as a learned individual whose work carried intellectual and spiritual significance. He maintained that painting should transcend mere imitation of nature, seeking instead to express deeper truths. This perspective placed him at odds with some of his contemporaries, who adhered to the Renaissance ideal of capturing the world with scientific precision. His bold assertion that Michelangelo was not a good painter reflects his confidence in his own artistic vision, as well as his willingness to challenge established norms. One of the most intriguing aspects of El Greco's career is the way in which his reputation evolved over time. While he achieved moderate success in Toledo, his work was largely forgotten after his death in 1614. The emergence of Baroque art, with its emphasis on realism and dramatic naturalism, pushed his unique style into obscurity. It was not until the 19th century that his paintings were rediscovered and reevaluated by art historians and avant-garde artists. Figures such as Eugene Delacroix and Pablo Picasso recognized in El Greco a precursor to modern artistic movements, particularly in his expressive distortions and bold use of color. Today, El Greco is regarded as a visionary whose work transcended the artistic trends of his time. His ability to synthesize diverse influences, from Byzantine iconography to Venetian colorism and Spanish mysticism, resulted in a body of work that remains strikingly original. His paintings continue to be studied for their technical innovation, emotional depth, and spiritual power. In museums and churches around the world, his masterpieces stand as a testament to an artist who refused to conform, instead forging his own path through the history of art. This dissertation will explore El Greco's journey in detail, from his early years in Crete to his final days in Toledo. It will examine the cultural and artistic environments that shaped his work, the challenges he faced in gaining recognition, and the legacy he left behind. By tracing his development across different artistic centers, Venice, Rome, and Spain, we can gain a deeper understanding of how he synthesized these influences into a singular, inimitable style. In the bustling port city of Heraklion, on the island of Crete, Domenico's Theotokopoulos was born in 1541. The island, a Venetian possession at the time, was a melting pot of cultures where East met West, and where the traditions of Orthodox Christianity coexisted uneasily with the influences of the Latin West. Theotokopoulos would later be known to the world as El Greco, the Greek, a name that both acknowledged his origins and underscored his foreignness in the places where he would eventually live and work. His early life in Crete would lay the foundation for the unique artistic voice that would emerge years later, one that was deeply spiritual, technically sophisticated, and resistant to easy classification. Crete, during El Greco's youth, was a center of the post-Byzantine artistic tradition. Following the fall of Constantinople in 1453, many Greek artists had fled to Crete, where icon painting continued to thrive. These icons, flat, hieratic, and symbolic, were not meant to portray the physical world as it appeared, but rather to open a spiritual window into the divine. It was in this rich, iconographic tradition that El Greco received his first formal artistic training. Apprenticed in an established workshop, he learned to mix pigments, prepare wooden panels, apply gold leaf, and execute the rigid forms and stylized expressions characteristic of Orthodox religious art. Theotokopoulos quickly distinguished himself as a young painter of considerable skill. His early works, though anonymous by modern standards, bore the hallmarks of careful composition and attention to detail, as well as a latent tension between convention and experimentation. Even in these formative years, some art historians believe they can detect signs of the individuality that would come to define his later masterpieces. There was a subtle elongation of figures, an intensity of expression, and a vibrant use of color that hinted at a restless creativity seeking new channels. Heraklion was more than a religious and cultural center. It was a gateway to the wider Mediterranean world. Ships came and went daily, carrying goods, ideas, and people between Venice, Constantinople, Alexandria, and beyond. As a Venetian territory, Crete maintained strong political and artistic ties to Italy, and Venetian merchants and officials were a constant presence in the city. This proximity to Western artistic trends meant that El Greco, unlike many of his contemporaries in other parts of Greece, had access to prints, engravings, and paintings by Italian masters. These glimpses into the evolving styles of the West likely planted the first seeds of ambition in the young artist. What must it have been like for a young man, steeped in the sacred tradition of Orthodox iconography, to encounter the naturalistic figures of Titian or the architectural grandeur of Palladio? Such encounters likely created a tension within Theotokopoulos, a conflict between tradition and innovation, between the sacred and the secular, between the static and the dynamic. As his talent matured, so too did his curiosity, and the limitations of Crete's artistic scene began to feel constraining. The rigid formalism of Byzantine art, though spiritually profound, left little room for personal expression. Theotokopoulos, it seemed, was already looking beyond the horizon. Very little is known about El Greco's family, but what little evidence survives suggests they were well-educated and possibly involved in commerce or administration. His father, Georgios Theotokopoulos, is thought to have been a tax collector or merchant, roles that would have placed the family in the ranks of Crete's urban middle class. This socioeconomic position likely afforded young Dominicos a certain level of education, perhaps even fluency in Greek, Italian, and Latin. Such linguistic ability would prove invaluable in his later travels and professional dealings in Italy and Spain. By his mid-20s, Theotokopoulos had completed his apprenticeship and had likely established his own workshop. His signature appears on at least one surviving icon, the Dormition of the Virgin, a piece that combines traditional Byzantine techniques with noticeable Western elements, such as spatial depth and more naturalistic facial features. This hybrid style suggests that El Greco was already experimenting with new modes of representation, blending the old with the new in a way that few of his contemporaries dared. It also signals the beginning of his departure from Crete, both physically and artistically. The island, for all its cultural richness, could no longer contain the ambitions of the young artist. Theotokopoulos had outgrown the artistic language of his homeland. What he sought could only be found elsewhere, among the masters of Italy, where Renaissance humanism was transforming the visual arts, and where new ideas about beauty, form, and proportion were being debated in the studios and salons of Venice and Rome. His decision to leave Crete around 1567 was not merely a change of location. It was a declaration of artistic independence. As he prepared to leave, Theotokopoulos would have looked back on his native island with a mix of gratitude and anticipation. Crete had given him the tools, the discipline, and the spiritual foundation on which to build his career. But it had also shown him the limits of inherited traditions. The sea voyage ahead would carry him not only toward a new geography, but toward a transformation of vision. The young Cretan icon painter was about to become a Renaissance artist, and ultimately, something more than that. As Dominicos Theotokopoulos set foot in Venice around 1567, he entered a world unlike any he had known before. The city was a beacon of artistic innovation, its canals teeming with merchants, scholars, and artists from across Europe. It was a place where ideas flowed as freely as commerce, where art was not merely an act of devotion, but also an intellectual pursuit, an exploration of beauty, light, and human emotion. For the young Cretan, trained in the rigid traditions of Byzantine iconography, Venice represented a radical departure from everything he had known. Here, the Renaissance had reached its full maturity, and artists were experimenting with perspective, anatomy, and color in ways that had never been seen before. At the heart of Venetian artistic life was the towering figure of Titian, the undisputed master of color and composition. By the time of El Greco's arrival, Titian was in the twilight of his career, yet his influence remained omnipresent. His bold use of color, rich reds, deep blues, and golden hues, gave his paintings an almost luminous quality, a technique that fascinated younger painters seeking to move beyond the linear precision of earlier Renaissance masters. It is believed that El Greco studied in Titian's workshop, or at the very least, closely observed his methods. He absorbed the Venetian approach to painting, in which color and light dictated form, replacing the more rigid, sculptural qualities of Florentine art. But Titian was not the only master who shaped the artistic atmosphere of Venice. Tintoretto, another towering figure of the Venetian school, was pushing the boundaries of composition, creating dynamic, almost theatrical scenes filled with energy and movement. His paintings often feature dramatic perspectives, plunging the viewer directly into the action, as well as bold contrasts between light and shadow. This sense of drama, this emphasis on movement and emotional intensity, would later become a defining feature of El Greco's own work. Likewise, Veronese, with his grand, decorative canvases and elaborate use of color, left a lasting impression on the young artist. Venice also introduced El Greco to a new way of thinking about art. Unlike the orthodox tradition in which he had been trained, where iconography followed strict formulas dictated by religious tradition, the Venetian Renaissance celebrated the artist as an individual, as a creative force with the power to interpret the world in a personal and expressive manner. Painters were not merely craftsmen. They were intellectuals, engaged in discussions about philosophy, poetry, and the nature of beauty. This idea of the artist as an independent visionary, rather than a mere servant of tradition, must have resonated deeply with El Greco. One of the most significant artistic transformations El Greco underwent in Venice was in his treatment of a human figure. In Crete, he had learned to paint stylized, almost symbolic figures that existed outside of time and space. In Venice, however, he encountered the fully realized, anatomically precise figures of Titian and Tintoretto, infused with life and movement. He studied how light played across flesh, how drapery responded to gravity, how gestures and expressions conveyed emotion. Yet even as he embraced these new lessons, he never completely abandoned his Byzantine roots. Rather, he fused them with the Renaissance techniques he was absorbing, creating a style that was neither fully Venetian nor fully Byzantine, but something entirely his own. El Greco's time in Venice was also an education in composition. The great Venetian painters were masters of organizing space within a canvas, creating depth and movement through the careful arrangement of figures. Perspective, which had been relatively absent in Byzantine iconography, became a crucial tool in his artistic vocabulary. However, rather than adhering strictly to the mathematical precision of linear perspective as practiced in Florence, El Greco favored a more intuitive, expressive approach. His compositions began to exhibit a dreamlike quality, where space was manipulated not for the sake of realism, but for dramatic and emotional effect. In addition to learning from the Venetian masters, El Greco was also exposed to the techniques of oil painting, which was relatively new at the time. Unlike the tempera used in Byzantine iconography, oil paint allowed for richer colors, smoother transitions, and greater depth. This medium gave him the freedom to experiment with blending colors, creating atmospheric effects that would become a hallmark of his later work. The ability to layer pigments and build up luminous surfaces gave his paintings an almost spiritual radiance, something that would be particularly important in his religious commissions in Spain. While the artistic environment of Venice was undoubtedly stimulating, it is unlikely that El Greco was entirely satisfied with being a mere student or assistant. Ambitious and confident, he was already forming strong opinions about art, some of which put him at odds with the artistic establishment. A particularly telling anecdote from this period suggests that he dared to criticize Michelangelo, claiming that the great Florentine was not, in fact, a good painter. Such a statement would have been considered audacious, if not outright heretical, in an era when Michelangelo was revered as one of the greatest artists of all time. Yet this boldness was characteristic of El Greco. He was not content to merely follow in the footsteps of others. He wanted to redefine artistic expression on his own terms. Despite the vast opportunities that Venice offered, El Greco did not remain there for long. Perhaps he felt that he had absorbed all he could from the Venetian school and needed to continue his artistic evolution elsewhere. Or perhaps he found himself unable to secure the prestigious commissions necessary to establish himself as a master in his own right. Whatever the reason, by the early 1570s, he had set his sights on Rome, the epicenter of the Italian Renaissance. If Venice had taught him about color, composition, and the expressive potential of oil paint, Rome would introduce him to the grandeur of monumental art, the intellectual discourse surrounding aesthetics, and the challenges of competing in a city filled with the finest artists of the era. As he departed Venice, El Greco carried with him not just technical skills, but a transformed artistic identity. He was no longer merely a Cretan icon, painter seeking new influences. He was now an artist in his own right, shaped by the Renaissance, but determined to forge his own path. El Greco arrived in Rome in the early 1570s, stepping into a city that had long been the artistic and intellectual heart of Europe. It was a place where the grandeur of antiquity coexisted with the innovations of the Renaissance, where towering cathedrals and ancient ruins served as a constant reminder of the city's enduring legacy. Rome had produced and nurtured some of the greatest artists of the era. Michelangelo, Raphael, and Leonardo da Vinci had left their mark on the city, and their influence still loomed over every aspiring painter. For a young artist seeking recognition, Rome was both an opportunity and a challenge. The city was alive with artistic experimentation, as painters, sculptors, and architects sought to push the limits of form, perspective, and expression. The Mannerist movement, which had emerged as a reaction to the harmonious ideals of the High Renaissance, was at its peak. Mannerist painters distorted figures, exaggerated proportions, and used unnatural colors to heighten emotional intensity. This emphasis on stylization and complexity must have resonated with El Greco, whose work would later adopt similar expressive distortions. But while Rome offered a wealth of artistic inspiration, it also presented El Greco with obstacles that he had not encountered in Venice. Unlike Venice, where art was celebrated for its vibrant use of color and expressive brushwork, Rome was dominated by an intellectual approach to painting. The influence of Michelangelo was pervasive, and the city's artists held his mastery of anatomy, structure, and grandeur as the highest standard of artistic achievement. While El Greco admired Michelangelo's architectural genius and sculptural skill, he remained critical of his painting. He rejected the heavy, muscular figures and dramatic postures that characterized Michelangelo's work, believing that true artistic greatness lay elsewhere. His bold criticisms, particularly his claim that he could improve upon the Last Judgment fresco in the Sistine Chapel, did little to endear him to the Roman artistic elite. El Greco's sharp opinions and independent spirit made it difficult for him to find acceptance among Rome's artistic circles. Unlike Venice, where he had studied under established masters and absorbed their techniques, in Rome he sought to define himself as an original thinker. He was invited to stay at the palace of Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, one of the most powerful art patrons in the city. The Farnese household was a gathering place for scholars, philosophers, and artists, and it was here that El Greco engaged in discussions about aesthetics, humanism, and the nature of artistic genius. However, despite the opportunities this environment provided, he struggled to establish himself as a leading painter in the competitive Roman art scene. His time in Rome was marked by experimentation. He continued to refine the techniques he had learned in Venice, but he also began to introduce elements that would become defining features of his later work. His figures became more elongated, their gestures more theatrical, and their expressions more intense. He experimented with light, using sharp contrast to create a sense of divine illumination, as if his subjects were touched by an otherworldly presence. Though these stylistic choices were unconventional, they hinted at the artistic vision that would later define his masterpieces in Spain. During his Roman period, El Greco also deepened his knowledge of architecture and sculpture. The grandeur of the city's classical ruins and the elaborate designs of Renaissance palaces undoubtedly influenced his understanding of space and composition. He studied the works of Bramante and Palladio, architects who had revolutionized the use of proportion and perspective. Though primarily a painter, El Greco would later incorporate architectural elements into his compositions, using columns, archways, and dramatic spatial arrangements to enhance the sense of depth and grandeur in his works. Despite his artistic growth, El Greco faced significant professional obstacles in Rome. He did not secure major commissions, nor did he establish the kind of patronage network that would guarantee long-term success. Some historians speculate that his outspoken nature and his resistance to conforming to Michelangelo's ideals contributed to his lack of recognition. Others suggest that his unique fusion of Byzantine and Renaissance influences simply did not align with the dominant artistic tastes of the time. Whatever the reason, it became clear that Rome would not be the city where he would achieve fame. By the mid-1570s, El Greco's frustration with Rome was likely growing. He had absorbed its artistic influences, engaged in its intellectual debates, and refined his techniques. yet he remained an outsider. His vision did not fit neatly within the established artistic schools, and his ambitions extended beyond mere imitation of past masters. He needed a place where his individual style could be appreciated, where he could develop his own artistic language without the constraints of rigid artistic traditions. His search for such a place would soon lead him to Spain. Spain, at this time, was undergoing a cultural and religious transformation. The Counter-Reformation had heightened the demand for spiritual and emotionally powerful religious art, and the Spanish court was eager to commission works that would reinforce Catholic doctrine. The monarchy, under Philip II, was investing heavily in grand artistic projects, particularly in the construction and decoration of the Escorial, a massive royal monastery. This environment presented an opportunity for El Greco, a chance to escape the expectations of the Italian Renaissance and find a setting where his dramatic, visionary style could flourish. As he left Rome behind, El Greco carried with him the lessons he had learned in Italy, but he was also ready to move beyond them. His time in Venice had given him a deep understanding of color and composition, while Rome had challenged him to define his artistic philosophy. El Greco's arrival in Spain in the late 1570s marked the beginning of a new chapter in his artistic journey, one that would define his legacy and allow him to develop the unique style for which he is known today. Unlike Venice and Rome, where he had struggled to find acceptance among the artistic elite, Spain presented new possibilities, shaped by its own distinct cultural and religious landscape. The country was at the height of its imperial power, and its leaders were looking for artists who could help reinforce the grandeur of Catholicism through powerful visual narratives. At the time of El Greco's arrival, Spain was undergoing a period of intense religious reform. The Counter-Reformation, a movement aimed at reasserting Catholic doctrine in the face of Protestant challenges, had fueled a demand for religious art that was emotionally stirring and spiritually uplifting. King Philip II, the devout ruler of Spain, was one of the chief patrons of this movement, commissioning grand artistic projects to adorn churches, monasteries, and royal residences. The Escorial, Philip's massive monastic palace, was the most significant of these endeavors, and it was there that El Greco first sought recognition. His initial destination was Madrid, the political center of Spain, where he hoped to gain favor at the royal court. Having been exposed to the grandeur of Venetian and Roman art, El Greco likely envisioned a role for himself as a royal painter, producing works that would rival the great commissions of Italy. He quickly secured an opportunity to present his talents to Philip II, submitting two paintings intended for the Escorial: the Martyrdom of Saint Maurice and the Adoration of the Name of Jesus. These works demonstrated his mastery of composition and color, incorporating the dramatic intensity he had cultivated in Italy. However, his encounter with the Spanish court did not unfold as he had hoped. Philip II, known for his austere tastes and preference for the solemn, restrained style of Flemish painters like Hieronymus Bosch, was not entirely impressed by El Greco's work. While his paintings displayed technical brilliance and a deep spiritual energy, they did not align with the king's rigid expectations for religious art. The rejection of his work for the Escorial was a significant setback, forcing him to reconsider his path in Spain. Despite this disappointment, El Greco did not allow the rejection to deter him. Instead, he turned his attention to Toledo, a city that, though not the political capital, was the spiritual heart of Spain. Toledo, with its rich history, stunning architecture, and deep religious traditions, proved to be the perfect setting for an artist whose work thrived on dramatic expression and mystical intensity. The city's Catholic leaders, intellectuals, and art patrons provided him with a welcoming environment where his style could be appreciated in a way that it had not been in Philip's court. Toledo's artistic community, though smaller than those of Venice or Rome, was deeply influenced by Spanish religious fervor. The city was home to numerous monasteries, cathedrals, and private patrons who sought devotional paintings that would inspire faith and devotion. Unlike the Renaissance ideals of balance and realism that dominated Italian art, Spanish religious painting was often characterized by an intense, almost supernatural quality, a perfect match for El Greco's expressive approach. His elongated figures, dramatic use of light, and ethereal compositions resonated with the Spanish desire for spiritual transcendence in art. It was in Toledo that El Greco received his first major commission in Spain, the altarpiece for the Church of Santo Domingo el Antiguo. This project was a turning point in his career, giving him the opportunity to showcase his artistic vision on a grand scale. The altarpiece featured towering figures bathed in an otherworldly glow, their elongated forms reaching toward the heavens in a visual expression of divine ecstasy. It was here that El Greco fully embraced the stylistic elements that would define his work: expressive distortions, vivid colors, and an emphasis on the mystical over the material. With the success of the Santo Domingo Commission, El Greco established himself as the leading painter in Toledo. He opened his own workshop, attracting a circle of assistants and students who helped him produce works for the city's churches, monasteries, and private patrons. His reputation grew, and he received commissions for portraits, religious scenes, and large-scale altarpieces. Unlike his experiences in Italy, where he had struggled to gain recognition, in Toledo he was celebrated as a visionary artist whose work captured the fervent spirituality of Spanish Catholicism. El Greco's integration into Toledo's artistic and intellectual circles also allowed him to engage with the city's scholars and theologians. He became friends with prominent figures such as Luis de Castilla, the son of the dean of Toledo Cathedral, who would become one of his most important patrons. These relationships provided him with a deeper understanding of Spanish religious thought, which further influenced his artistic choices. His paintings became not only visual representations of biblical stories, but also profound meditations on faith, redemption, and the divine. Despite the success he found in Toledo, El Greco never fully abandoned his ambition of achieving broader recognition. He continued to send works to Madrid in the hope of securing royal commissions, but he remained largely overlooked by the Spanish court. Yet in many ways, his artistic isolation allowed him to develop his unique style without external pressures to conform. In Toledo, he was free to create works that transcended the artistic norms of his time, paving the way for a legacy that would only be fully recognized centuries later. As he settled into life in Toledo, El Greco had finally found a place where his vision was embraced. The city, with its deep spirituality and dramatic landscape, became the backdrop for his most extraordinary works. Once El Greco was firmly rooted in Toledo, he began to transform his artistic vision into a prolific and multifaceted operation. No longer simply a painter searching for patronage, he evolved into the head of a thriving workshop, an enterprise that not only allowed him to respond to the increasing demand for his art, but also enabled him to explore his ideas on a grander scale. The Toledo workshop became his creative stronghold, a place where inspiration met production, and where his singular style matured into a fully articulated language of form, light, and spirituality. The structure of the workshop followed a model common in Renaissance and Mannerist Europe, but under El Greco's leadership, it developed a character as unique as the artist himself. He employed a team of apprentices, assistants, and collaborators who helped him produce altarpieces, portraits, and devotional works. These assistants often executed background details, secondary figures, or repetitive elements under the master's direction, allowing El Greco to focus on the key figures and expressive force of each composition. However, his distinctive style remained unmistakable, even in workshop pieces, due to his precise supervision and rigorous standards. Situated in a large house in Toledo's historic center, the workshop buzzed with activity. The house itself, reputedly spacious and adorned with elegant courtyards, reflected the artist's status and refined sensibilities. Here, surrounded by books, drawings, and half-finished canvases, El Greco lived and worked, merging domestic life with his artistic production. His interest in literature, philosophy, and theology was evident in the intellectual atmosphere of the studio, which often hosted discussions with clerics, scholars, and patrons. The fusion of artistic labor and intellectual inquiry made the space a rare blend of creative practice and theoretical reflection. The workshop's output was diverse. El Greco received commissions not only from local churches and religious institutions, but also from noble families seeking portraits or devotional panels. Each project was tailored to the patron's spiritual and aesthetic expectations, yet all bore the unmistakable hallmarks of El Greco's hand. Figures stretched toward heaven, elongated hands and faces, and glowing, almost electric hues that gave his subjects an aura of divine presence. His compositions, even in smaller pieces, pulsed with intensity and drama. One of the most impressive aspects of El Greco's workshop was its consistency. Despite the high volume of work produced, the quality rarely faltered. This can be attributed to his careful planning and his ability to instill a shared artistic vision among his collaborators. Many of his assistants became adept at mimicking aspects of his style, though none could replicate the full force of his expression. Over time, certain motifs and patterns became recurring features in the studio's production. Gestures, facial expressions, and color schemes that tied the works together into a cohesive visual universe. As his fame in Toledo grew, so did the expectations of his patrons. El Greco responded by creating increasingly complex and ambitious compositions. He often revisited the same subjects, saints, biblical scenes, and mythological themes, offering new interpretations with each version. This repetition was not the result of stagnation, but of deep artistic exploration. He used these opportunities to experiment with color harmony, emotional intensity, and spatial manipulation. His willingness to revisit and refine his ideas revealed a restless creativity, always searching for new dimensions of expression. Among the many commissions completed in the workshop, some stood out as masterpieces that garnered widespread admiration. These large-scale works required coordination and planning on a level that few artists could manage. El Greco's organizational abilities, combined with his visionary approach, enabled him to complete monumental altarpieces that transformed the interiors of Toledo's churches. These works were not merely decorative, but intended to elevate the viewer's soul, inviting contemplation through their celestial compositions and otherworldly light. The financial side of the workshop was equally sophisticated. El Greco managed his commissions with the precision of a businessman, negotiating contracts, setting delivery schedules, and often disputing payments when patrons failed to meet agreed terms. Surviving documents show his keen awareness of the value of his work and his refusal to be undervalued. His confidence in his abilities translated into a firm stance in matters of compensation and professional respect. This business acumen helped sustain his practice during periods of economic uncertainty and fluctuating patronage. Despite the workshop's success, El Greco never compromised his artistic ideals for commercial gain. He continued to paint with a sense of spiritual urgency and expressive intensity that sometimes confounded more conservative viewers. His art was not meant to comfort, but to provoke, to stir the soul, and awaken a sense of the divine. Even in commissioned portraits, his subjects were not flattered, but transformed, rendered with an inward glow that suggested moral or spiritual depth rather than worldly vanity. This insistence on depth and substance over superficial appeal set him apart from many of his contemporaries. By the time El Greco had fully established himself in Toledo, his artistic vision had undergone a profound transformation. No longer bound by the stylistic constraints of his early Venetian and Roman influences, he had developed a distinctive approach to religious painting, one that defied conventional representation and sought to evoke a direct emotional and spiritual response. His art no longer aimed for mere realism. Instead, it strove for transcendence, using exaggerated forms, ethereal lighting, and a deeply personal interpretation of divine presence. El Greco's religious paintings from this period are marked by an unprecedented intensity. Saints, apostles, and biblical figures were no longer depicted as earthly beings, but as radiant, elongated entities infused with an almost supernatural energy. Their gestures became more dramatic, their faces more expressive, and their robes seemed to flow like liquid fire. These distortions were not errors or eccentricities, but deliberate choices, meant to elevate the subject beyond the material world. In El Greco's vision, heaven and earth coexisted on the canvas, and the viewer was invited to witness the moment when the divine broke through the boundaries of human existence. One of his most striking innovations was his use of light. Unlike the naturalistic chiaroscuro techniques used by his Italian contemporaries, El Greco employed an internal radiance that seemed to emanate from within his figures. His saints and angels glowed, their elongated limbs illuminated by an unearthly brilliance that set them apart from the darker, earthly tones of the background. This technique heightened the sense of spiritual ecstasy in his works, making his paintings feel like visions rather than mere representations. His use of color was equally groundbreaking. While Renaissance painters sought harmony through naturalistic tones, El Greco boldly embraced contrast and intensity. Electric blues, burning oranges, and luminous whites clashed and swirled together, creating compositions that felt alive with divine energy. The unreality of his color schemes reinforced the otherworldly nature of his subjects, dissolving the boundaries between human perception and spiritual revelation. His palette was not meant to imitate nature, but to evoke a higher, ineffable truth. The emotional power of his religious paintings was further amplified by his radical approach to space and composition. Instead of adhering to the balanced, symmetrical structures favored by Renaissance artists, El Greco often arranges figures in swirling, chaotic movements that defied gravity. His compositions frequently tilted upward, drawing the viewer's gaze toward the heavens, as if the entire painting were in the process of ascending. This vertical dynamism became a hallmark of his work, reinforcing the idea that his paintings were not simply images, but portals to divine experience. A prime example of this new vision is the Burial of the Count of Orgaz, one of his most celebrated masterpieces. This monumental painting, created for the Church of Santo Tomé in Toledo, encapsulates all of El Greco's artistic principles. The lower half of the composition, grounded in the physical world, depicts the earthly burial of a nobleman, rendered with meticulous detail and realism. But above, the scene dissolves into a celestial vision of heaven, where elongated angels and saints welcome the Count's soul into eternal glory. The contrast between the two realms is stark yet seamless, embodying the very essence of El Greco's spiritual philosophy, the coexistence of a human and the divine. This painting was not merely a technical achievement, but a deeply personal statement of faith. In Spain, where Catholicism was undergoing a period of intense renewal through the Counter-Reformation, religious art was expected to serve a didactic purpose, to inspire devotion and reinforce doctrinal teachings. El Greco's paintings fulfilled this function, but did so in a way that was entirely his own. His works did not simply tell biblical stories. They conveyed the feeling of spiritual transformation, as if the viewer were witnessing a sacred revelation. El Greco's approach to religious painting was not without controversy. Some of his contemporaries, particularly more traditional artists and clerics, found his distortions excessive and his compositions too unconventional. His rejection of strict realism and his preference for expressive exaggeration challenged the artistic norms of the time. However, his supporters saw in his work a reflection of mystical spirituality, perfectly suited to the religious fervor of late 16th century Spain. His patrons, many of whom were high-ranking members of the clergy, understood that his art was not meant to depict the physical world, but to transport the soul beyond it. The growing intensity of his religious vision also led him to revisit and reinterpret familiar subjects. Saints and biblical figures that he had painted early in his career now took on even more dramatic and otherworldly forms. St. John the Baptist, the Annunciation, and the Pentecost, themes he had explored before, were now infused with a heightened sense of movement, light, and transcendence. These later versions bore little resemblance to the restrained compositions of the Venetian school. Instead, they seemed to vibrate with divine energy, as if the figures themselves were being consumed by the spiritual ecstasy they represented. As his reputation grew, El Greco's religious paintings came to define the artistic landscape of Toledo. His altarpieces adorned the city's churches, his portraits of saints became treasured devotional images, and his unique style influenced a new generation of Spanish painters. But his vision remained singular, unbound by convention or expectation. While other artists sought to perfect their craft within the framework of tradition, El Greco used his art to challenge perception itself, offering glimpses of a world where heaven and earth were not separate realms but intertwined realities. While El Greco is most renowned for his religious paintings, his portraiture stands as another remarkable facet of his artistic genius. His ability to capture not just the physical likeness of his sitters, but also their inner essence set him apart from his contemporaries. His portraits were not mere representations of status or wealth. They were psychological studies, windows into the souls of his subjects. In a time when portraiture often served as a means of self-aggrandizement, El Greco's approach was deeply introspective and filled with spiritual intensity. One of the defining characteristics of El Greco's portraits is the haunting expressiveness of his figures. His subjects, whether noblemen, clerics, or scholars, are rendered with penetrating gazes and faces that seem to reveal the weight of their thoughts. The eyes in his portraits are particularly striking. They often appear luminous, as if they hold some deep, unspoken truth. Unlike the smooth idealization seen in Venetian or Flemish portraiture, El Greco's figures have an almost sculptural quality, with sharp cheekbones, elongated features, and hands posed in delicate yet meaningful gestures. His use of color in portraiture was another innovation that distinguished his work. While many artists of the time favored dark backgrounds and restrained tones to emphasize realism, El Greco infused his portraits with an ethereal glow. His sitters often appear wrapped in rich blacks, deep blues, or shimmering whites, standing out starkly against neutral or abstract backgrounds. This contrast not only heightened the drama of the composition, but also gave the impression that the figure was emerging from darkness into light, reinforcing the idea of spiritual or intellectual revelation. One of his most celebrated portraits, Portrait of a Cardinal, showcases El Greco's ability to convey power and introspection simultaneously. The cardinal, dressed in resplendent red, is captured mid-thought, his face both stern and contemplative. There is no attempt to flatter or soften his features. Instead, El Greco presents him as a man of both authority and deep reflection. The brushwork is loose yet precise, with delicate details in the folds of fabric contrasting against the more expressive handling of the facial features. Another masterpiece of his portraiture is the nobleman with his hand on his chest, a work that exemplifies his capacity to convey character through minimal elements. The sitter, dressed in simple yet elegant attire, makes a solemn gesture of self-assurance and integrity. His gaze is direct yet reserved, as if he is aware of being observed but remains deeply in his own world. The composition is stripped of unnecessary details, focusing entirely on the interplay of light, expression, and form to create an image that transcends mere representation. El Greco's portraits of religious figures were equally compelling. His depictions of monks, priests, and scholars reveal a fascination with the intellectual and spiritual dimensions of his subjects. Instead of portraying them as remote, idealized figures, he infused them with a sense of human vulnerability and introspection. Wrinkled brows, deep-set eyes, and elongated fingers pointing toward heaven conveyed not only piety, but also the burden of knowledge and faith. These figures did not simply represent religious devotion. They embodied the struggle of the human soul in search of divine truth. Despite his success in Toledo, El Greco's portraiture did not receive the same widespread patronage as his religious paintings. Unlike the Spanish court painters who specialized in grand, idealized depictions of nobility, El Greco's portraits were too introspective and unconventional for those seeking images of worldly splendor. His rejection of strict realism in favor of expressive exaggeration meant that some potential patrons may have found his style too idiosyncratic for their tastes. Yet, for those who appreciated his work, his portraits were not just likenesses but profound character studies, unmatched in their ability to capture the essence of an individual. Beyond commissioned portraits, El Greco also painted numerous self-portraits, though few are definitively attributed to him. These works, if indeed his own, suggest a deep awareness of his place in history and his artistic legacy. His self-portraits depict a man of intense intellect, his features sharp and defined, his gaze both searching and self-assured. Unlike the self-portraits of some of his contemporaries, which often emphasized wealth or status, El Greco's self-representations focused on the mind behind the art, emphasizing his role not just as a painter, but as a thinker and visionary. The influence of El Greco's portraiture extended beyond his own time. Though not widely appreciated in his era outside of Toledo, his bold approach to capturing psychological depth would later inspire artists such as Francisco Goya, Edouard Manet, and Pablo Picasso. His ability to strip away superficial details and focus on the core of his subjects being resonated with later generations who sought to push portraiture beyond mere imitation. As El Greco entered the final decades of his life, the presence of his son, Jorge Manuel Theodokopulos, became increasingly central to both his personal and professional world. Born in Toledo in 1578, Jorge Manuel was the only child of El Greco and Geronima de las Cuevas, a woman about whom little is historically documented, but who likely had a profound influence on the painter's life. From an early age, Jorge Manuel was immersed in the creative atmosphere of his father's workshop, and his path toward artistic apprenticeship seemed inevitable. Unlike El Greco, who had crossed borders and immersed himself in diverse cultural traditions, Jorge Manuel was raised within the singular and spiritually intense context of Toledo. This shaped his understanding of art and devotion in a very different way. His early training under his father instilled in him a deep respect for the expressive, transcendent style that defined El Greco's mature works. However, Jorge Manuel would gradually develop a more restrained and traditional aesthetic, more aligned with the tastes of early 17th century Spain. Despite this stylistic divergence, he remained a loyal collaborator in the workshop for many years. By the late 1590s, Jorge Manuel had taken on greater responsibility in the studio, helping to manage commissions, oversee assistants, and complete works under his father's supervision. Contracts and workshop documents from this period frequently bear his name, suggesting that he acted as a kind of intermediary between El Greco and their patrons. In this role, Jorge Manuel displayed a sharp sense for business and administration, qualities that balance his father's more visionary, often uncompromising temperament. As El Greco aged, his son became more than just an assistant. He became the steward of the workshop's future. The two men often collaborated on major commissions, and though the elder master typically conceived the compositions and executed key elements, Jorge Manuel's hand can be seen in the more practical aspects of production. Architecture, ornamentation, and even background figures were often entrusted to him. He developed a particular aptitude for architectural design, and in later years, he would pursue independent projects in this field. The partnership between father and son was not merely functional. It was also deeply emotional. While El Greco maintained an aura of mystery in much of his personal life, surviving documents reveal a consistent concern for Jorge Manuel's education and professional development. Their relationship, though built around artistic labor, was rooted in a familial bond that added richness to their collaboration. Jorge Manuel, in turn, appears to have revered his father's genius, even as he sought to define his own artistic identity. After El Greco's death in 1614, Jorge Manuel became the primary heir to both the estate and the legacy. He faced the formidable task of preserving his father's reputation in a world that had not fully embraced his style. At the time, artistic trends were shifting toward a more classical and restrained aesthetic, exemplified by artists like Diego Velázquez and Francisco Pacheco. In this changing environment, El Greco's expressive distortions and intense spirituality were increasingly seen as eccentric rather than visionary. Jorge Manuel worked diligently to protect and promote his father's legacy. He completed unfinished works, maintained the studio's contracts, and continued producing art in the workshop's established manner. At the same time, he struggled with legal and financial issues related to outstanding payments and commissions, a common reality in the artistic economy of the time. In several court cases, he defended the value of his father's works, asserting their worth in the face of skepticism from patrons who consider the art unorthodox or overly expensive. Though Jorge Manuel's own artistic output never reached the heights of his father's, he played a crucial role in preserving the body of work that would later astonish the modern world. Without his dedication, many of El Greco's paintings might have been lost, altered, or forgotten. His stewardship ensured that the works remained intact within churches, private collections, and municipal holdings around Toledo. He also contributed to the continuity of El Greco's visual language, influencing a modest but lasting circle of local followers. In addition to painting and studio work, Jorge Manuel pursued a parallel career in architecture. He was appointed master builder of Toledo Cathedral in 1625, a prestigious position that allowed him to apply his understanding of design on a monumental scale. Though his architectural style bore little resemblance to his father's expressive brushwork, it demonstrated his versatility and the breadth of his training. His buildings, measured, harmonious, and solid, stood in quiet contrast to the soaring, otherworldly energy of El Greco's painted visions. By the time Jorge Manuel passed away in 1631, the legacy of El Greco was still dormant in the wider world. Yet thanks to his son's devotion, the physical remnants of that legacy remained intact. The canvases, the sketches, the documents, and the echoes of a workshop that had once challenged the very fabric of artistic convention were preserved, waiting for a time when their brilliance would finally be recognized. When El Greco died in 1614, his work was met with a mixture of admiration, indifference, and outright rejection. Toledo had been his home, his sanctuary, and the backdrop for his most audacious artistic explorations. But even in the city that had embraced him, opinions about his paintings were divided. His exaggerated forms, bold colors, and mystical visions stood apart from the prevailing artistic trends of early 17th century Spain, where the emerging Baroque style favored naturalism, dramatic realism, and a closer adherence to classical ideals. As time passed, El Greco's reputation faded into relative obscurity, and his works, though never entirely forgotten, were largely misunderstood by the generations that followed. For more than 2 centuries, El Greco was regarded as an anomaly, an artist whose peculiar style placed him outside the accepted narratives of art history. While his paintings remained in the churches and institutions of Toledo, they were often overlooked in favor of artists such as Diego Velázquez and Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, whose works better aligned with Spanish artistic traditions. Collectors and scholars of the 17th and 18th centuries saw El Greco's distortions as evidence of technical weakness or personal eccentricity rather than artistic intention. His visionary compositions, once considered daring and spiritual, were dismissed as erratic and mannered. However, El Greco's work did not disappear entirely. His paintings survived in the churches and monasteries of Spain, quietly awaiting their rediscovery. In the 19th century, with the rise of Romanticism, a new appreciation for individualism and artistic rebellion began to take hold. Romantic painters and writers, fascinated by unconventional genius and dramatic expression, started to take an interest in El Greco's art. The Spanish artist Francisco Goya, known for his haunting and expressive works, is believed to have been influenced by El Greco's emotive intensity. His admiration marked the beginning of a slow but significant reevaluation of El Greco's place in art history. The true revival of El Greco's reputation, however, did not begin in earnest until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when European modernists saw in his work a kindred spirit. French and Spanish critics, disenchanted with rigid academic traditions, began to recognize the radical nature of El Greco's vision. His elongated figures, vibrant colors, and disregard for strict realism resonated with the aesthetic concerns of symbolist and post-impressionist painters, who were seeking new ways to represent the human form and emotional depth. One of the most significant moments in El Greco's rediscovery came in the early 20th century, when artists such as Pablo Picasso and the German Expressionists openly acknowledged his influence. Picasso, in particular, saw in El Greco's distortions and dramatic compositions a precursor to Cubism. His famous painting Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, 1907, often regarded as the foundation of modern art, bears traces of El Greco's influence in its fragmented forms and bold reimagining of space. Expressionist artists, such as those of the Die Bruck movement in Germany, also found inspiration in El Greco's emotional intensity and use of color. At the same time, art historians and critics began to reconstruct El Greco's legacy, recognizing him not as an eccentric outlier, but as a revolutionary master ahead of his time. Scholars delved into his Greek origins, his Venetian training, and his exposure to the intellectual currents of Spain's Golden Age. They reassessed his paintings not as technical aberrations, but as deliberate expressions of a deeply personal artistic and spiritual vision. Museums and collectors started acquiring his works, elevating his status from a local curiosity to a central figure in the history of Western art. By the mid-20th century, El Greco's position as one of the great masters of European painting was firmly established. Major exhibitions in Spain and abroad celebrated his genius, and his works became prized additions to the collections of the world's most prestigious museums, including the Prado in Madrid, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and the National Gallery in London. His once maligned style was now seen as a bold precursor to modernism, and his name was spoken alongside those of Michelangelo, Titian, and Caravaggio. In his adopted city of Toledo, El Greco's legacy experienced a resurgence of pride. The house where he had lived and worked was transformed into the El Greco Museum, dedicated to preserving his memory and showcasing his contributions to art. The city, once home to the artist who had struggled for recognition, now embraced him as an essential part of its cultural and historical identity. Pilgrims of art and history traveled to Toledo to stand before the burial of the Count of Orgaz, just as they would journey to see the Sistine Chapel or the works of Rembrandt and Van Gogh. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of El Greco's legacy is the way his work continues to inspire and challenge contemporary artists. His radical approach to form, his fearless manipulation of color, and his spiritual intensity remain relevant to those who seek to push the boundaries of artistic expression. His paintings, once considered too strange to fit within the classical canon, now stand as timeless works that transcend stylistic categories, appealing to anyone who recognizes the power of art to evoke emotion and alter perception. In the end, El Greco's story is one of triumph, not in his own time, but in the centuries that followed. He was a man who painted beyond the limits of his age, an artist who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be imagined through faith and vision. His rediscovery was not just the revival of a forgotten master, but the recognition of an artist whose work speaks across time, challenging and inspiring all who dare to look beyond the ordinary. Through the twists of history, his light was never truly extinguished. It merely waited for the right moment to shine once more.